Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, to a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. Now, take a long, drafty breath, like one drawn in a chilly abbey corridor, and let's slip into the linen-sleeved world of medieval queens, those crowned women of clout who ruled in fur-lined cloaks, whispered secrets behind embroidered fans, and somehow made political treachery look like courteous embroidery. Our first queen wears many names, but history's favourite is Eleanor of Aquitaine, noblewoman, duchess, crusader, and possibly the only woman in history to pack an army for a honeymoon. Let me set the scene. 12th century France, roughly the time when castles were cold, baths were considered suspicious, and cheese had absolutely no chill. Little Eleanor was born into one of the wealthiest families in Europe, surrounded by more troubadours than toothbrushes, and quite used to hearing poetry dedicated entirely to her ankles. Her father, Duke William X, an excellent name for someone who probably owned more falcons than friends, died when she was 15, making her Duchess of Aquitaine, which was sort of like being handed the title deeds to half of modern France, along with a terrifying legal brief. The ink was barely dry on the paperwork before King Louis VII married her faster than you can say strategic land grab. Now, Louis was many things: pious, gentle, arguably allergic to fun, but not quite a match for Eleanor. She liked literature, politics, and open windows. He liked monks, long silences and penance. She was more velvet and rebellion. He was more sackcloth and Gregorian chants. Nevertheless, off they trotted on the Second Crusade. Eleanor, gloriously inappropriate in armour that probably jingled melodiously at every step, and Louis, solemn behind a cross and a horse prone to sulking. Some chroniclers say Eleanor brought 300 handmaidens, which seems unlikely, but deliciously absurd if true. Imagine the amount of combs. Imagine the caravan of gossip. The crusade, bless it, was a hot mess. There were ambushes. There was heatstroke. At one point, Eleanor and her ladies were accused of pretending to be Amazons. The journey ended in weary disillusionment in Antioch, where Eleanor possibly got just a bit too cozy with her Uncle Raymond, and Louis got just a bit too jealous. By the time they trudged back to Paris, their marriage was in spiritual shambles, and in a rare act of medieval common sense, they agreed to separate, or as court scribes put it, annul the union on the grounds of consanguinity, which is medieval legalese for "we now claim we're cousinish enough to call it quits." But Eleanor wasn't finished, not even slightly. Within months, she married a man 11 years her junior, Henry Plantagenet, future King of England. A decision that sent gasps echoing through every drafty corridor in Europe. It was bold, it was ambitious, it was technically a power move, and perhaps a bit romantic, in that I like a man with good armour and a decent cavalry kind of way. Together, Eleanor and Henry produced 8 children, among them Richard the Lionheart and King John. Yes, that one from the Robin Hood stories who made tax collectors seem like delightful dinner guests. But motherhood was not a passive role. Eleanor advised her sons, managed estates, and even led resistance against Henry. She spent 15 years imprisoned for backing their rebellion, sipping a metaphorical goblet of maternal frustration. Still, Eleanor endured. She outlived Henry, arranged royal marriages like a medieval bachelorette empress, and became something of a queenly whisperer in her later years. When her grandson needed a governess in faraway Castile, she didn't just write a nice letter about embroidery. She rode there herself, at nearly 80. Even the dusty chroniclers had to concede she was a force of nature. One monk described her as a woman whose charm bewitched nations, which is monk talk for, we still haven't quite figured her out, but goodness, she kept us busy. So now, my wide-eyed dreamers, let's nestle into our pillows and drift a little deeper into the smoky tapestries of the past, where queens carved power into scrolls and silence, and the scent of ink and rosewater drifted down corridors of stone. And remember, if Eleanor could rearrange 2 kingdoms between supper and scandal, you can definitely press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. Good night, and onward. Imagine a forest somewhere between legend and actual footnotes, where castles peer through mist like curious old owls, and monarchs rise and fall like so many overly ambitious soufflés. It is here, just past the year 1100, that we tiptoe into the silken slippers of one of medieval Europe's spinniest political spiders, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, if your idea of a medieval queen is a mild, embroidery-loving background accessory to serious crown-wearing men, well, Eleanor would have laughed into her goblet and probably outplanned you by dessert. Born in 1122 in what is now southwestern France, Eleanor entered the world not with a whimper, but with 200,000 acres of land, enough wine to bribe an army, which she may or may not have done later, and a healthy disregard for being told what to do. She became Duchess of Aquitaine at the ripe age of 15. Most teenagers get acne and existential dread. Eleanor? She got an inheritance the size of Belgium. Almost immediately, she was married off to Louis II of France, a man so devout he once considered not marrying at all. He was the human equivalent of a damp hymn. Still, the wedding went ahead, and Eleanor, already well-read, sharp-witted, and fluent in approximately 5 more languages than Louis, found herself Queen of France. They embarked on the Second Crusade together, a couple's vacation that went about as well as you'd expect when one half is determined to wage holy war and the other is accused of flirting with her uncle in Antioch. Eleanor, draped in armor and rumor both, insisted on traveling with her own retinue of ladies, poets, and options. Louis sulked. The crusade fizzled like a candle in a windstorm made of poor decisions. Their marriage ended soon after in a rare for the time annulment, citing the classic royal excuse: we're too closely related. Convenient, considering they'd had 2 daughters already. Now single and still in possession of the most desirable duchy in Europe, Eleanor did not exactly retire to a nunnery with a cat and a regret. No, just weeks later, she married the future King Henry II of England. This was an absolute power move. Picture medieval Tinder, and Eleanor's profile just swiped right on England. Henry was a fierce, brilliant, highly energetic volcanic event in human form. Together, they ruled over what was probably the most powerful blob of land in Western Europe. France, England, bits of Ireland. It all came under their increasingly complicated roof. Historians even call this watery empire the Angevin Empire, which sounds fancy until you realize it mostly meant a lot of horses, castles, and letters being sent back and forth at glacial speeds. Eleanor and Henry had 8 children, because apparently there weren't enough royal headaches on the continent. Among them, Richard the Lionheart, famously good at crusading, not so great at papal diplomacy, and John, famously bad at everything, including holding on to his crown without accidentally triggering the Magna Carta. But married bliss, this was not. Henry was unfaithful, Eleanor was unforgiving, and probably more importantly, she was involved in a rebellion. Yes, in one delightful twist, Eleanor supported her sons in active revolt against their father. Picture it. Regal family dinners with Eleanor passing the gravy to one of her would-be army commanders, while Henry glared into his potatoes, wondering which of his progeny would betray him next. Eventually, Henry locked Eleanor up in what polite chroniclers refer to as house arrest, and what unpolite ones would call medieval grounding. But greater queens are seldom silenced for long. After Henry's death, Eleanor returned to the very heart of politics, acting as regent for her absent crusading son, Richard, and later negotiating John's shaky rule from behind the scenes. She even negotiated royal marriages on the literal edge of collapse, dashing across mountains well into her 70s, in an age when 50 was considered advanced creaking. She died at the Abbey of Fontevraud in 1204, having outlived husbands, children, and several diplomatic predictions of doom. Her tomb lies next to Henry's, both carved in stone, her figure reading a book, just in case the afterlife needed a queen with cultural depth and a sharp eye for succession. And so, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, Queen of England, Duchess, Rebel, Mother, Regent, Raconteuse, drifts into history like a whisper wearing velvet. Now, as her page gently turns, another queen's shadow stirs in the candlelight. Some queens forged empires, others forged scandal. And then there was Empress Matilda, who attempted both and ended up inventing the world's most passive-aggressive civil war instead. Now, before our tale floats off into the drama of Matilda's rather stormy reign, let's uncork a vintage drop of British medieval chaos. It's the 12th century. Castles are damp, heating is a concept that involves dogs, and the English throne is still something you can snatch if no one's looking directly at it. Matilda, also known as Maud, because medieval record-keeping was half heroic saga, half game of telephone, was born in 1102 to King Henry I of England. Unlike most women of her time, she wasn't raised entirely to sew, wed, and produce heirs like a royal vending machine. Instead, she was packed off to Germany at age 8 to marry the future Holy Roman Emperor. You know, just a little European excursion to become an empress in your preteens. Her husband, Emperor Henry V, was a strict man with a fondness for reminding everyone of how holy and Roman he was, despite not being especially Roman and, if we're being entirely honest, moderately holy. But Matilda adapted. She learned to navigate courts, intrigue and governance, occasionally while draped in jewels, heavy enough to qualify as exercise equipment. When her husband inconveniently died, no foul play, just medieval hygiene, Matilda returned to England, widowhood fully achieved, imperial dignity in tow. Her father then announced, with all the subtlety of a medieval drum circle, that Matilda would be his heir. This shocked a kingdom unaccustomed to women doing anything particularly ambitious, other than praying or dying of something poetic like a chill in the lungs. Still, King Henry got the nobles together, made them swear allegiance to his daughter, and probably thought, sorted. Spoiler, nothing was sorted. When Henry died in 1135, England collectively decided to pretend the whole Matilda as heir plan had been a quaint suggestion. Enter Cousin Stephen. Stephen. Mild-mannered, occasionally charming, and fatally underqualified to run a kingdom. He nipped across the channel and took the crown faster than Matilda could say, "Wait a moment, that's mine." What followed was nearly 2 decades of family squabbling, conveniently dubbed the Anarchy, which, to be clear, is not nearly as fun as it sounds. It involves siege warfare, burned villages, shifting loyalties, and sufficient backstabbing to qualify as a salon sport. Matilda raised armies, crossed treacherous terrain in winter, and even escaped from Oxford Castle disguised in white, blending in with the snow like a very angry snow ghost. This was history's answer to hide and seek, but with fewer happy reunions and more trebuchets. Still, there was one major issue: charm. Stephen had it. Matilda, less so. She was efficient, intelligent, and profoundly unimpressed by medieval nonsense. But charm mattered. She alienated allies almost as fast as she conquered castles. At one point, she entered London to be crowned, victorious, triumphant, royal, and somehow left again in a huff, chased out by townspeople who were unimpressed with her tax policies and perhaps her reluctance to perform the royal equivalent of small talk. So no, Matilda never officially became Queen Regnant, but she did something arguably more powerful in the long run. She ensured that her son, Henry, yes, another Henry, eventually took the throne. With elegant medieval irony, Stephen agreed to name Henry as his heir, acknowledging that perhaps monarchy should slightly favour competence after all. Thus, Matilda, the almost queen, the empress with a sword, faded into history's shadowed alcove, her legacy shimmering softly in her son's rule. A woman who clawed her way through male-dominated chaos, not by waiting passively, but by marching, and occasionally storming. Her tale reminds us, never underestimate a widow in armour. Now, wriggle your toes, adjust your metaphorical crown, and allow yourself to drift further back into the golden haze of medieval power plays. There's another queen, waiting in the winding corridors of time, with her own scandalous tiara and secrets whispering beneath velvet. By the time Eleanor of Aquitaine glided into the corridors of power, Europe had already met a few formidable queens. But Eleanor rewrote the royal playbook while wearing velvet slippers and a crown that probably had more jewels than a small cathedral had candles. She was born in 1122, give or take a scribal error or two, in the lush duchy of Aquitaine, which was basically medieval France's artsy, wine-soaked corner. While most noble ladies were practicing embroidery and demure silence, young Eleanor was learning Latin, court politics, military tactics, and probably how to win an argument in at least 3 languages. At just 15, Eleanor inherited Aquitaine, an enormous, wealthy region, roughly the size of a modest kingdom, and with more troubadours per square mile than most medieval maps had dragons. In a move that combined pragmatism with a touch of theatrical flair, she married France's Crown Prince Louis. Within weeks, Eleanor was crowned Queen of France, and Aquitaine was, on parchment at least, part of the French realm. But here's the twist. Louis, later King Louis VII, was more monk than monarch, a gentle soul who preferred praying to jousting and pondering to plotting. Eleanor, meanwhile, practically brimmed with courtly ambition and fondness for the finer, occasionally spicier things in life. You could say they were not spiritually aligned. She liked poetry. He liked penance. Their royal honeymoon took an unexpected detour when they joined the Second Crusade, which turned out to be less of a blessed pilgrimage and more of a sunburned disaster. Eleanor, riding at the head of her own battalion of knights, scandalized Europe by dressing, how dare she, in armor. Some even claimed she modeled her troop after Amazons, those fearsome lady warriors that Greeks once wrote about when short on real problems. The crusade flopped, as crusades often did, and cracks in the royal marriage deepened. When the couple finally returned home, tired, dusty, and perhaps existentially over it, Eleanor decided enough was enough. She petitioned for an annulment, and in a rare burst of ecclesiastical common sense, the church granted it. The grounds, too closely related, which was technically true, for a royal couple of the 12th century, being fourth cousins, was practically like being siblings. Now single and still unfathomably rich, Eleanor did what many post-divorce 30-year-olds do. She married a hot 19-year-old. Only in her case, the 19-year-old was Henry Plantagenet, future King of England, who might have been dashing, ambitious, and reasonably literate. A real catch by medieval standards. 2 years later, she became Queen of England, which is just as fancy as it sounds. Together, she and Henry produced 8 children. Not so much a family as a dynastic startup. Among them was Richard the Lionheart, future action figure of the Crusades, and King John, of Magna Carta fame and Robin Hood shame. But domestic tranquility is hard to come by when you're married to someone who keeps trying to centralize power, and you, Eleanor, would prefer to keep a little for yourself. Eventually, Henry made the classic marital mistake of imprisoning Eleanor for inciting their sons to rebel against him. Yes, medieval family therapy often required chains and castles. She remained under a sort of royal house arrest for 16 years, long enough to read the collective works of any available monk, or just memorize the precise layout of every damp stone in her chamber. But Eleanor wasn't finished. Oh no. After Henry died, she emerged, older, wiser, spectacularly unbothered, and became regent for her son, Richard. While he was off crusading, fighting salad bar skirmishes with Saladin, it was Eleanor who ran England. She negotiated treaties, raised ransoms, and possibly reminded every baron within earshot that she had been doing this ruling thing since before most of them were in chainmail diapers. In her final years, she retired to a convent, not as a retreat, but likely as a form of structured peace and quiet. Maybe to write a scathing review of everyone's poor political decisions, or perhaps to finally sit still and enjoy some poetry without anyone trying to start a war. And so, Eleanor of Aquitaine drifted into historical legend, the queen who outlived a king, outmaneuvered her enemies, and outmothered a generation of rulers, a duchess by birth, queen by title, and legend by sheer force of will. Now, let's dim the torchlight a little more as a regal shadow begins to stir beyond the Alps, where another queen waits with schemes of her own. Picture this. It's the year 1137. The wind smells vaguely of roasted boar, incense, and poorly washed tunics. In the heart of France, a girl of just 15 years old is suddenly informed that she is not only to be queen, but also something more dangerous, more intoxicating, and infinitely more complicated. She's now the most eligible bachelorette in all of Christendom. Her name? Eleanor of Aquitaine. If medieval queens were gemstones in a royal crown, Eleanor was the massive sapphire that caught the sunlight and refused to sit still. Born into wealth and power as the daughter of the Duke of Aquitaine, Eleanor's inheritance included more lands than the French king himself could swagger through on a good day. It made her one of the most desirable matches in Europe, by political standards at least, though it must be said, she was more than merely a valuable parcel of grass and peasants. She was whip-smart, fluent in Latin, well-versed in the art of diplomacy, and, by most accounts, a woman who could give a knight a philosophical argument while he flailed his sword. It wasn't long before the French crown came calling, or tripping rather. King Louis XVI, sometimes called Louis the Fat, which is not particularly polite, but a historical fact nonetheless, arranged for his son, Louis the Younger, to marry young Eleanor. The union made sense on paper. Consolidate power, absorb Aquitaine, serve wine, conjugate Latin verbs over the roast pheasant. But there was a catch. Louis the Younger, bless his monastic little heart, had been raised to be a monk. Then, in what can only be described as a dynastic plot twist, his older brother died in a freak accident involving a horse and a surprising lack of survival skills. Young Louis found himself jolted from asceticism into kingship, from prayers to battles, from chants to the complex and rather fragrant politics of medieval courtship. Eleanor, meanwhile, brought Aquitaine into the French crown and possibly a few headaches into the French court. Where Louis was soft-spoken and deeply pious, Eleanor was sociable, extravagantly cultured, partial to troubadours, and unapologetically opinionated. She didn't just wear the crown, she adjusted its fit. Yet marital bliss did not gallop over the hill to serenade them. Louis went on crusade, yes, that traditional bonding activity for medieval couples, and Eleanor insisted on coming along, wearing armor and leading her own troop. This was, to put it gently, not received well. Women in battle were about as welcome as a particularly loud lute at a silent vow ceremony. Still, she went. Not one to sit around embroidering regrettable tapestries, Eleanor marched to the Holy Land, possibly scandalizing the male nobility and absolutely roasting under her chainmail. The crusade was a disaster, and by the end of it, the royal marriage was bending uneasily like a soggy parchment map in the rain. They managed to produce 2 daughters, but to Louis and his advisors, a lack of male heir was a diplomatic bummer. Finding little reason to continue sharing castle corridors, the 2 royals had their marriage annulled, citing consanguinity, or being too closely related by blood. Amusingly, this hadn't been much of a concern when they inherited each other's duchies. But Eleanor didn't retire to a nunnery. Oh no. Within mere weeks of her annulment, Eleanor was scandalously swooped up by none other than Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy, future King Henry II of England, and proud owner of a volcanic temper. He was 11 years her junior, a vigorous 19 to her sophisticated 30. Imagine the gossip in those old stone hallways. She'd gone from a monkish French king to the fiery founder of the Angevin Empire, and she didn't even spill her wine along the way. Between them, they would control more of France than the French king himself, plus England, which at the time was essentially mud, sheep, and civil war. Eleanor gave birth to 8 children. One of them would become Richard the Lionheart. Another would become King John, he of Magna Carta. Fame, infamy, and general surliness. She entertained courts, commissioned poetry, led armies against her own husband in a rebellion, yes, really, and, after Henry locked her up for 16 years, re-emerged in her 70s to politically choreograph Europe, like a cross between a grandmother and a chess grandmaster. Eleanor didn't merely survive the Middle Ages, she directed them. She remains one of history's towering women, not just for marrying 2 kings and birthing quite possibly the most dysfunctional royal family since the gods of Mount Olympus, but for living with zeal, stubbornness, and an unerring talent for turning catastrophe into legacy. And while many queens receded gently into history's velvet shadows, Eleanor rode through it like a comet, brilliant, unpredictable, and entirely unwilling to be ignored. Now, should you wish to continue drifting gently deeper into slumber, don't stir. Our next queen is rather fond of keeping whisper-worthy secrets, and the halls of her castle are already humming with quiet mischief. Eleanor of Aquitaine did not walk. Eleanor of Aquitaine swept, shimmered, and occasionally startled grown men into nervous stammering. all while wearing 12 pounds of embroidered silk. Born in 1122 into one of the wealthiest duchies in France, Eleanor wasn't just rich, she was Duchess rich. Landowning, castle collecting. My dowry is bigger than your army rich. At 15, she inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine, a chunk of southwestern France so vast it looked like someone accidentally scrolled the feudal map too far to the left. Instantly, Eleanor became the most eligible bachelorette on the continent, and promptly, like any self-respecting medieval heiress with an overwhelming sense of self-assurance, she married the future King of France, Louis VII. Now, Louis was, how shall we put this affectionately? He was pious like a man who confused monastic vows with romantic vows. Imagine pairing a fiery political genius with a man whose idea of marital bonding was silent prayer and asking Saint Denis if he was being too forward at dinner. Their marriage was less wild passion and more mildly awkward sermon. And yet, Eleanor tried. She accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade, which, if you're unfamiliar, was essentially a very long group vacation to the Holy Land with less sunscreen and more sieges. Eleanor insisted on coming as the Duchess of Aquitaine and brought with her a retinue of ladies dressed as Amazons. Yes, actual medieval cosplay. Riding side saddle into one of the least successful crusades in history. The nuns were scandalized, the knights were divided, and Eleanor was, in her own quietly exasperated way, completely unfazed. The idea of being told where not to go or what not to wear simply never occurred to her. Inevitably, after years of mutual holy confusion and one deeply embarrassing public disagreement about marching routes through Anatolia, Eleanor and Louis had their marriage annulled. Officially, due to consanguinity, that is, being too closely related by blood, which, let's be honest, was the medieval version of it's not you, it's genealogy. Being suddenly single again in mid-12th century Europe, and a duchess no less, meant Eleanor immediately became the continent's most heavily watched bachelorette again. Nobles from every corner of Europe tried to court her. Some sent jewels, some sent letters, and one tried to kidnap her. Seriously, Geoffrey of Anjou allegedly tried an abduction-turned-proposal on the road to Poitiers. Eleanor, unimpressed but characteristically impervious, swerved the whole escapade and proceeded to marry his son instead, Henry Plantagenet. Henry, future King of England, was 11 years her junior, and basically a human thunderstorm disguised as a red-haired duke. Their relationship was passionate, in the sense that windows rattled when they argued, and they had 8 children together. Yes, 8, including 3 who would become kings, 1 who would wear a hair shirt, and 1 who would try to put Eleanor under house arrest. Family dinners were probably tense. Eleanor's time as Queen of England was a masterclass in political tightrope walking. She ran the Duchy of Aquitaine like a sovereign, heavily influenced courtly culture, patronized poets, and likely glared intimidatingly at more bishops than a papal conclave. But her greatest magic trick? Surviving decades of medieval court politics, 2 royal marriages, the Crusades, and rebellious children, including Richard the Lionheart and that other one, John. Yes, that John. The one that lost Normandy and annoyed every historian except the ones who enjoyed writing insults. When Henry and Eleanor's power struggle reached its peak, he did what most medieval monarchs did when confronted with a strong-willed wife. He confined her to a series of fortified castles for 16 years. But here is where Eleanor becomes even more indelible. She outlived Henry. She lived long enough to see her son Richard become king, to act as his regent while he crusaded, with more focused success than his parents, and to utterly ignore everyone who told her at 70-something that she was too old to ride across the Alps while arranging royal marriages by hand. Eleanor died in 1204, aged around 82, in a time when you were lucky to hit 40. Her legacy was not merely survival, but dominance, a duchess, queen, prisoner, mother of kings, and self-made legend. Sleep now, with the gentle rustling of silk gowns beneath cathedral arches, and the distant, sweet laughter of ladies arguing in Occitan poetry. Someone is waiting in the wings, a northern queen with a crown made of ambition and salted air. While most queens of the medieval world ruled behind silk curtains or beneath pearl-draped veils, there was one who strode into power with chainmail beneath her brocade gowns and a suspiciously sharp dagger always within reach. Allow me to introduce Joanna d'Affay of Naples, a woman so gossiped about that medieval minstrels ran out of scandalous verses midway through her career. Joanna reigned in the 14th century, during a time when Naples was less a sunny Italian vacation spot and more a boiling cauldron of papal politics, feuding nobles, and enough family betrayal to make a Shakespearean ghost raise an impressed eyebrow. She didn't so much inherit her crown as she inherited an entire soap opera script, conveniently written in Latin and sealed in blood. Joanna was crowned queen at the tender age of 15, which in medieval years is roughly equivalent to having already survived 3 assassination attempts and a marriage proposal from a mildly inbred cousin. She married her first husband, Andrew of Hungary, a situation best described as both politically convenient and romantically doomed. The problem with Andrew, apart from sounding like the sweet name of a pet donkey, is that he wanted to be king, not just by marriage, but with full sovereign authority. Joanna was understandably not keen on being second fiddle in her own opera. As one can imagine, subtle conversations were had, perhaps by candlelight, possibly with ominous violin music in the background. And then Andrew was found mysteriously dangling from a balcony one fine evening. As you can guess, gravity received a lot of the blame, but most people squinted in Joanna's direction with raised eyebrows and murmurs of murderous queen. Was she involved? History is fuzzy, like an ancient woolen sock. What happened next was the Renaissance version of a PR crisis. The Hungarians, furious about Andrew's sudden transition from prince to pancake, invaded Naples, because nothing says grief like a vengeful cavalry. Joanna, ever resourceful and not interested in surrendering either her crown or her head, fled to Avignon to plead her case to the Pope. Now, if you're imagining a sorrowful queen in mourning robes, whispering prayers under moonlight, banish the thought. Joanna stormed into the papal court in full regal splendor and, according to some sources, charmed the Pope so thoroughly that he forgave her alleged crimes based solely on lack of evidence and her notoriously dazzling eyes. The Pope even married her to a second husband, which is the 14th century version of writing a Yelp review that says, would allow to reign again. Joanna's next few husbands had mixed fortunes. One died in battle, another possibly poisoned, yet another was just kind of there. She collected marriages the way some people in our time collect odd coffee mugs, with increasing suspicion and decreasing enthusiasm. Despite the turbulent throne, armed invasions, and the occasional poisoned goblet, Joanna continued to rule Naples for over 3 decades, maintaining a delicate balance between power, scandal, and truly excellent fashion. She was deeply involved in politics, a patron of the arts, and, most daringly, tried to play Pope matchmaker during one of the Catholic Church's many dramatic splits, a move comparable to telling two sword-wielding cats to share the same blanket. Eventually, her own grandnephew decided it was high time someone else had the crown. This charming fellow went by the name Charles of Durazzo, and rather than write a strongly worded letter, he simply invaded and deposed her. Joanna, who had escaped papal jail, Hungarian troops, and several husbands, was finally betrayed by someone who shared her blood. Because, as we've learned, in medieval Europe, family reunions often ended with armies. Joanna died imprisoned. Some say strangled. Others say starved. Some even imagine she simply sighed deeply and decided she was done. A tragic end befitting a queen who outlived 4 husbands, 8 wars, and an unusually high number of medieval rumors. But legends, like velvet cloaks, tend to linger long after their owners are gone. In time, people looked back on Joanna not just as a scandalous ruler, but a competent, fascinating sovereign who reigned in a time when women were expected to do little more than embroider quietly and not get in anyone's way. As you rest now, imagine her walking along the marble halls of Castelnuovo, skirts trailing, candlelight flickering, the whisper of courtly secrets behind every door, and perhaps, just perhaps, a glint of that dagger still shining beneath her sleeve. Now, if that wasn't quite enough regal intrigue for one night, the next queen we meet was properly crowned, canonized, and still managed to start a war from the comfort of her writing desk. As fog uncurled over the gently drafty landscape of 12th century Saxony, a queen sat stone-faced and calculating beneath her wimple. Picture long halls echoing with the hushed rustle of silk skirts and the occasional clattering of chainmail. A fashion-forward sharpness was required for this job, after all. Her name was Matilda of England, the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, at least once upon a political alliance. And while she didn't rule from an iron throne, she certainly had a spine of it. Let's drift quietly into her story, one not gilded in fairy dust, but in perseverance, powdered wigs. Well, metaphorically. It was a bit early for wigs, and sheer medieval headache. Matilda was fierce, formidable, and fantastically inconvenient to the men of her time. Born in 1102, she was the daughter of King Henry the Fern of England and, here's where it gets delightfully tangled, she was meant to rule. Yes, a ruling queen. Something the Normans hadn't quite penciled into their feudal mood boards yet. Henry, pragmatic to the point of paranoia, declared Matilda his heir after his only legitimate son inconveniently drowned in what might be history's least relaxing boat ride, the White Ship disaster of 1120. Tragic, yes, but from a lineage perspective, like misplacing your last remaining heir in a rather soggy fashion. Thus, Matilda stepped toward the throne, only to find it occupied by her cousin, Stephen of Blois, sitting upon it like the world's most political chair thief. Now, dear dreamer, here's where the story picks up speed like a runaway ox cart. The English barons, much like squirrels when presented with a jackhammer, panicked. They preferred a predictable usurper to a legitimate but, oh dear, female ruler. Antiquated brains in noble heads often struggled with novelty. But Matilda wasn't about to let someone named Stephen ruin the narrative. She invaded England in 1139. That's right. She crossed the Channel in armour, launched a civil war, the Anarchy, aptly named, though not very restful sounding, and began what we might call the world's least festive game of musical thrones. For nearly 2 decades, Matilda outmaneuvered, outlasted, and occasionally outdramaed her rivals. She didn't win immediately or easily, but her impact reached far beyond her own reign. One near victory tasted particularly sweet. In 1141, she captured Stephen and had him locked in chains. A satisfying moment, if not exactly bedtime material, unless your idea of comfort is legal confinement and a power vacuum. Her supporters even declared her Lady of the English. But the coronation stalled when she began acting like, well, a queen with authority. Evidently, this was too much for medieval sensibilities. The nobles recoiled, upset that she showed more backbone than embroidery. And yet, despite the setbacks, Matilda's legacy was less about immediate wins and more about maternal strategy. Her ultimate triumph lay in negotiating peace and securing her son's future. That son, Henry II, would go on to become one of England's most capable and occasionally temperamental rulers. Picture a boy raised by a woman who challenged the kingdom, walked battlefields in full regalia, and wasn't afraid to tell a bishop where he might file his opinions. It puts Tiger Mom in a whole new context. Matilda later ruled Normandy in her own right, managing lands, correspondence, and diplomacy with the sort of brisk authority that made scribes squint from all the extra paperwork. She redefined the possibilities for medieval queenship, not a consort, not a pretty accessory to crown and conquest, but a blunt force of political will. Instead of silencing herself, she taught her son how to listen to power, to wield it, and when necessary, to wrestle with it in chainmail. She died in 1167, buried in Rouen, beneath a tomb that famously called her daughter of a king, mother of a king, but never a queen. A slight misrepresentation, perhaps, for if ruling is in the doing, not the title, Matilda surely earned her chapter in the annals of queenship. So now, with the scent of parchment and distant torchlight softening in the corridors of memory, we close the heavy oak door behind Empress Matilda. But not to worry. Just beyond awaits another queen with a crown full of secrets and a court full of mischief. Some queens are remembered for their iron rule, some for their lavish courts, and a special few for their remarkable ability to make intrigue and scandal look like part of the royal wardrobe. Then there was Isabella of France, daughter of a king, wife of a king, and mother of another, who happened to help remove the second one from the throne. If medieval royalty were a chessboard, Isabella was the queen who knocked over the board, poured herself a goblet of Bordeaux, and declared checkmate before anyone remembered whose move it was. Born sometime around 1295, with all the ambiguity medieval calendars cheerfully allowed, Isabella was the daughter of King Philip IV of France, better known as Philip the Fair, though his concept of fairness mostly applied to his bone structure, not his politics. Philip arranged her marriage to King Edward II of England, hoping for peace between their kingdoms and presumably someone to keep Edward II from excessive hobbies, like his infamous favourite pastime, ignoring his wife in favour of his male companions. When Isabella was sent across the Channel in 1308 to marry Edward, she might have expected the usual royal awkwardness: distant husband, chilly castle halls, banquet food optimistically described as edible. What she didn't expect, and neither did English nobility, was Edward's utterly transparent devotion to Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight whose influence over the king was, shall we say, exceptionally affectionate. At her coronation, Isabella had the symbolic but ultimately humiliating honour of watching her husband spend more time admiring Gaveston's fashion choices than his queen's presence. Courtiers politely murmured their disapproval. The barons, not so politely launched political daggers at Piers, which eventually became literal. His exile, return, and final sticky demise in 1312 created more palace drama than an entire season of a medieval soap opera. Isabella weathered this storm with unnerving grace. Even when Edward replaced Piers Gaveston with another companion of questionable platonicness, one Hugh Despenser the younger, Isabella smiled, bore royal children, and gave the appearance of composure. But inside, one imagines, she was quietly sharpening a metaphorical dagger, embroidered with fleur-de-lis. By 1325, Isabella had had enough of Despenserian nonsense. Sent to France on a diplomatic mission, she simply chose not to return. Oh, and by the way, while in Paris, she formed an alliance with another disgruntled English nobleman, Roger Mortimer. The two quickly became close, politically, strategically, and probably also very romantically, though medieval chroniclers, trying to stay employed, simply wrote, and they became companions. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer launched what was essentially a hostile corporate takeover of the English crown. They landed in England with troops, popular support, and just enough noble encouragement to make the whole thing look almost constitutional. Edward II, faced with the medieval equivalent of bad Yelp reviews from every baron in the realm, fled badly and was eventually captured. And here we tiptoe delicately into historical murk. Edward II was imprisoned, and in 1327 officially abdicated in favour of his teenage son, Edward III. Not long after, Edward II inconveniently died in captivity. The cause of death was, as they say, complicated, with whispers of red-hot pokers and dramatic exits that may have been more fiction than fact. Whatever the truth, Isabella and Mortimer were in charge now. Now here's the thing about ruling as a usurpatory regency duo. You need to be subtle. Mortimer was not. He enjoyed titles, wealth, and the distinct aroma of hubris. Isabella, often depicted as a cunning politician, may have worn the crown of power, but that crown grew heavier by the year. Her son, Edward III, grew older, craftier, and less thrilled about being controlled by Mum and her charismatic boyfriend. In 1330, young Edward decided he'd play the rebellious teenager card, but with royal consequences. He staged a nighttime coup, arrested Mortimer, and rather impolitely had him hanged. Isabella, spared the gallows thanks to her motherly status, was gracefully retired to Norfolk with a generous pension and, by most accounts, a cache of fine dresses and better memories. She lived nearly 30 more years quietly, with ample embroidery and no further rebellions. Perhaps she'd had her fill. Or perhaps she was simply biding her time, just in case chessboards were set up again. As moonlight slips over the battered towers of England's past, we leave Isabella sipping her quiet twilight, a queen who dared more than most, and managed to remain regally enigmatic in history's flickering torchlight. Ahead, another ruler waits, cloaked in myth and crowned in legend, far away, in the flickering candlelight of 12th century France, where troubadours sang of chivalry and someone was always going on a crusade. There lived a queen so intriguing that poets couldn't decide whether to fear her or fall for her. Her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine. And yes, that Aquitaine, a lush region famous for vineyards, castle intrigue, and being inherited mostly by accident. Eleanor was born into one of the wealthiest duchies in Europe, which automatically made her kind of a big deal. At the tender age of 15, she inherited the duchy. That's right. While other teenagers were stressing over embroidery samplers and courtly etiquette, Eleanor was inheriting enough land to make even the most powerful kings start humming medieval gold-digging ballads. Being clever, and by clever we mean absolutely formidable, Eleanor wasted little time securing her position. Her hand in marriage became the most sought-after prize in Europe, second only to the Holy Grail, and possibly some well-aged Gouda. She married the King of France, Louis VII, a man whose personality has been generously described by historians as pious and mild-mannered, or, if we're being honest, a bit of a damp scroll in human form. The marriage was not a storybook romance. For one, Eleanor was vibrantly political, witty, and fond of lively courtly affairs, while Louis was more interested in monasteries than monarchy. Naturally, they went on a romantic and deeply unadvisable honeymoon, also known as the Second Crusade. Ah yes, the Second Crusade. Nothing says marital bonding quite like trudging across hostile territories toward Jerusalem, sometimes on horseback, often on foot, occasionally while dodging arrows. Eleanor joined the campaign wearing armour and leading a contingent of troops from Aquitaine. Some chroniclers, clearly flustered by the entire situation, accused her of bringing immoral behaviour to the army camps. Most of these accusations were probably written by cranky bishops still nursing sunburns and shattered expectations. Long story short, the crusade went poorly, perhaps because it was run like an overambitious camping trip by nobles who hadn't packed snacks. Afterwards, the tension between Eleanor and Louis was less whispered court gossip and more Baroque soap opera. Their marriage was annulled, mostly because they were too closely related, though one imagines it also had something to do with Eleanor's obvious eye rolls during royal discussions. Now legally unattached and still owner of the vast Aquitaine lands, Eleanor did what any sharp-witted duchess with dynastic superpowers might do. She married the hot-tempered and cunning Henry Plantagenet, who shortly thereafter became King Henry II of England. Just like that, Eleanor upgraded from Queen of France to Queen of England, in what was surely one of the most impressive royal rebounds in history. Together, Eleanor and Henry created what could charitably be called a complex family, although most historians prefer words like explosively dysfunctional or absolute Tudor rehearsal. They had 8 children, 5 of whom were sons, and nearly all of them took turns rebelling against their father. It became sort of a family tradition, rather like Sunday roasts, but with sieges. Eleanor, never one to let paternal tyranny win the day, eventually sided with her sons in rebellion against Henry. For someone who once travelled across enemy-infested terrain in armour, defying her husband in political warfare was just a natural Thursday. This did, unfortunately, result in Eleanor spending around 15 years under house arrest. Not a loose, luxury kind of house arrest. More a no forbidden banquets or secret letters sort of confinement. Yet, Eleanor survived. And not just survived, thrived. After Henry's death, she emerged from her enforced retirement like a medieval Beyoncé, releasing a surprise album. She ruled as regent while her favourite son, Richard the Lionheart, was off gallivanting through the Third Crusade. At over 70 years old, Eleanor rode across Europe to arrange marriages, negotiate treaties, and generally hold the threads of England's tangled politics together. In a time when most women her age were presumed to have retired into quiet piety or become abbesses with strong opinions about embroidery. She wasn't perfect. She could be sharp-tongued and ruthlessly pragmatic. But Eleanor of Aquitaine remains one of the most vivid, independent queens in European history. A woman who turned annulments into strategy, royalty into legacy, and never once mistook obedience for virtue. And as the candlelight fades on the rolling hills of Aquitaine, we drift now to another court, further north, where another queen waits, draped in furs, shrouded in secrets, and perhaps sipping a suspiciously spicy mead. In the misty corridors of medieval memory, one sometimes stumbles, not upon a quiet nun or pious relic, but rather into a throne room echoing with sarcastic laughter and unapologetic power. If you're lucky, or perhaps unlucky depending on your political leanings, you might find yourself in the company of Queen Joanna of Naples. Let's begin gently, with silk slippers and papal disputes. Joanna, spelled with any number of interpretive vowels by 14th century scribes, was crowned Queen of Naples in 1343. She was just 16, which in medieval noble years is the equivalent of 3 internships, a betrothal, and at least one highly inconvenient inheritance. The Kingdom of Naples, balmy and filled with enough drama to rival any Roman holiday, sat trembling under dynastic pressures, Napoleonic flair long before there was a Napoleon, and familial expectations so high they could cast shade on Mount Vesuvius. Joanna was not the sort to swoon. Raised in the lavish Neapolitan court, she had been trained in languages, theology, and most usefully, how to navigate the slings and arrows of papal politics while wearing pearls. When her grandfather, King Robert the Wise, decided she was the best candidate to rule Napoleon's Naples, he perhaps underestimated just how spicy a reign Joanna's would become. He probably envisioned prudent diplomacy, a calm regency council, and the occasional falconry tournament. What ensued was instead a symphony of scandal, suspicion, and 4 marriages, each slightly more eyebrow-raising than the last. Her first husband, Andrew of Hungary, arrived rather sulkily in Naples, as he felt a man should not need to share his crown. Unfortunately for dear Andrew, Naples felt otherwise. The barons murmured, Joanna gracefully outmaneuvered, and then Andrew was mysteriously found hanging from a curtain rod during a nighttime stroll, a method of death not commonly self-inflicted. To be clear, historians still debate whether Joanna had anything to do with Andrew's curtain-related demise. She claimed innocence. She also hosted his funeral, with just enough solemnity to make people wonder whether she was mourning or mildly inconvenienced by the lack of proper interior drapery afterwards. Of course, Andrew's brother in Hungary was less than thrilled. The Hungarians stormed into Naples under the sword-bearing leadership of King Louis the Great, searching for justice, vengeance, or perhaps just someone to blame. Joanna, not one to face awkward dinner guests at spear point, fled to Provence with excellent timing and expensive luggage. There, she explained her side of the story to Pope Clement VI, a man she knew rather well, having lent him liberal quantities of Neapolitan coin during his rise in Avignon. To everyone's surprise and the Pope's evident relief, he declared her not guilty and threw in a holy pardon for good measure. It turns out, having receipts and papal IOUs can be very useful when your husband meets an inconvenient fate atop a curtain rod. With ecclesiastical blessings tucked firmly into her bodice, Joanna returned to Naples wearing the queenliest of smiles and promptly married again, this time to Louis of Taranto, a cousin twice removed and ambitions once multiplied. Their union was stormy but fruitful, by which I mean politically strategic, not necessarily cozy. Joanna ruled for nearly 40 years, a remarkable feat considering the average medieval monarch either died in battle, was poisoned by a relative, or choked on elaborately prepared goose. She survived invasions, betrayals, and plague years, all while maintaining an unflappable poise and an allegedly legendary wardrobe, which the Italian chroniclers described in thrilling detail that rivaled war reports. Critics called her cunning. Supporters called her just. She preferred divinely appointed, which has a nice ring to it when embossed on royal stationery. And yet, perhaps she was just a woman surviving among vipers, playing the throne game in a world where queens had to be twice as clever and 3 times as ruthless, if only to not end up as footnotes. Her reign was not without murals of misstep, but in the gallery of medieval monarchs, Joanna's portrait hangs framed in bold brushstrokes. Regal, fierce, gracefully accused of regicide, and entirely unapologetic. Now, let your thoughts drift with the slow tides of the Tyrrhenian Sea, where Neapolitan winds whisper of queens who outlasted empires, and one in particular who once silenced her critics simply by outliving them. As the palace torches dim in the distance, we sail onward to meet another regal enigma, cloaked in velvet and political cunning. Some queens earned their crowns with divine blessings, some through cunning statecraft, and then there was Joanna I of Naples, a woman who ruled with grace, endured with grit, and attracted scandals like knights to a jousting field. Her life dance stepped somewhere between royal soap opera and courtroom drama, only with more tiaras and dramatically embroidered veils. Born in 1326, under the not-so-unassuming gaze of the Angevin dynasty, little Joanna was handed a significant burden right from the start. Her grandfather, King Robert the Wise, decided she would inherit the Kingdom of Naples. That would be quite the gift even today. Imagine being told at 9, "Oh yes, sweet Jojo, when you grow up, you'll be queen of a Mediterranean kingdom. Now run along and practice Latin." But Naples, in those days, was not merely sunshine and olive oil. It was a political chessboard polished with betrayal, with many players always one goblet of wine away from murder. Robert's choice to skip over male contenders and name Joanna as heir ruffled enough feathers to redecorate an entire aviary. At 16, Joanna married Andrew of Hungary, her cousin. Yes, her cousin. Because what better way to preserve peace in the family than an awkward royal marriage? The twist? Papa Hungary still thought Andrew should have the crown, even though Robert, in his divine non-wisdom, had clearly penciled Joanna's name in bold. Tensions escalated faster than you can say medieval inheritance dispute. Andrew, poor soul, was not exactly a charmer. His attempts to claim more political power made him wildly unpopular, especially among the Neapolitan nobles, who viewed him with all the affection one might reserve for gout. One warm September night in 1345, a canopy rope snapped, or rather, was cut, and Andrew was found very inconveniently murdered during a hunting trip. Joanna was promptly blamed. When you're a young queen with enemies, even your alibis need alibis. Now, it's never a relaxing moment when your cousin husband is murdered and your in-laws declare war. But Joanna handled it with the sort of poise most of us can only summon when our coffee order is wrong. She fled Naples for Avignon, the seat of the papacy at the time, to plead her case before Pope Clement VI. There, in a dusty, incense-scented court, filled with papal intrigue and suspicious glances, Joanna calmly explained that the nobles acted without her knowledge. Would the Pope believe such a tale? He did. Or rather, he approved of her enough to sell her the city of Avignon, which she paid for like it was a casual trip to the medieval version of Zara. Then, in one of history's quiet mic drops, she returned to Naples and resumed her reign. Resistance, dear insomniac listener, proved surprisingly optional. Over time, Joanna would marry not one, not two, but 4 husbands. Not all at once, mind you. This wasn't medieval speed dating. Each marriage was a careful political maneuver, like assembling IKEA furniture blindfolded. She navigated dynastic pressures with a queenly sense of balance. One moment, she was soothing tensions with the papacy. The next, she was battling competing claimants from Hungary or the stirring grumbles of insubordinate barons. Despite the chaos swirling around her, Joanna became known for fairly progressive policies. She abolished the death penalty in Naples, gave female witnesses the same weight as males in court, a radical thing at the time, and encouraged the arts with the zest of someone trying to outshine Florence. In short, she balanced brutality and benevolence like a sovereign yogi before yoga was trendy. But dynasties, like sandcastles and soufflés, rarely stand forever. Near the end, Joanna made a decision that would cost her everything. She threw her support behind the anti-pope, yes, that was a thing, during the Western Schism, openly opposing Pope Urban VI. This move, bold as it was, did not delight the actual pope, who promptly endorsed Charles of Durazzo, Joanna's cousin, again with the cousins, to depose her. Charles happily obliged. In 1382, Joanna was imprisoned in a fortress and later smothered with a pillow. A quiet end, for a queen who rarely knew peace, but lent it to others where she could. Yet even that somber end hums with the irony of her rule. A woman shaped by dynasties, judged by popes, chased by cousins, and remembered as a ruler who tried, and occasionally succeeded, to make her realm a little more just, in a time made almost entirely of chaos. And as Naples drifted into another chapter of feuding nobles and dramatic coronations, the night grew a little quieter. Waiting patiently for our next queen to emerge from the shadows of history, Margaret of Denmark had the sort of ambition that didn't knock at the door politely. It raised a velvet-gloved fist and let itself in. But unlike some queens whose ambitions rattled sabers or summoned armies, Margaret preferred paperwork, treaties, and just the tiniest whiff of passive-aggressive diplomacy. You know the type. Smile sweetly while dismantling your sovereignty. Born in 1353, Margaret was the daughter of King Valdemar IV of Denmark and the last child of a long and very medieval string of 8. Sadly for her brothers and mercifully for her own political prospects, she outlived them all, an early demonstration of her unusually robust staying power. Denmark, it seems, builds its queens to last. Now, if history were a board game, which it sort of is, just with more beheadings and less plastic, Margaret would have been that one player quietly hoarding property, trading shrewdly, until halfway through the night, the others look up and realize she controls the entire Scandinavian peninsula. At age 10, she was married off to King Haakon VI of Norway, another charming royal with a dynasty in need of durable heirs and Danish connections. By all accounts, their union was unremarkable, though perhaps politely cordial, like a long diplomatic email exchange that never quite reaches the point. Still, Margaret bore a son, Olaf, and just like that, she inherited the 2 oldest royal weapons in the northern toolbox: proximity to power and a child with a crown-shaped destiny. When her father died in 1375, Margaret nimbly maneuvered her infant son onto the Danish throne. Understandably, being 3 years old made it rather difficult for Olaf to issue decrees or enforce tax reforms, so Margaret, now acting as regent, ran the show on his behalf, and she ran it with the brisk efficiency of a woman who knew when to draft policy and when to outmaneuver noblemen who had all the strategic foresight of damp bread. She soon added Norway to the family's crown collection, as one does, and then waited, as mothers do, for her son to mature into kingliness. Unfortunately, fate leaned heavily on the dramatic side. Olaf died young, at just 17, and Margaret, who had clearly skipped the chapter on retiring with dignity, stepped forward to rule in her own right. And now, dear listener, we arrive at the snack platter of Margaret's legacy, the Kalmar Union. Think of it as medieval Scandinavia's version of a group project. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, all politically glued together under one crown. Margaret spearheaded this unification in 1397 with an elegance that somehow combined monarchical consolidation with family therapy. Sweden, famously allergic to being ruled by foreigners, periodically objected to this arrangement, and by objected, we of course mean invaded, revolted, or grumbled loudly at council meetings. Still, Margaret held it together, with a steely grace and an occasional bribe, keeping the union grounded through diplomacy, sheer cunning, and the miracle of static governance. She ruled not officially as queen in name, but as all-powerful lady and mistress of the three kingdoms. That's a real title, by the way. Go ahead and embroider it on a pillow. It's the kind of mighty designation that makes regular queens look like understudies. From the outside, Margaret's rule looked almost quiet. There were no sweeping military conquests, no scandalous love affairs shouted from castle balconies. But beneath the surface, she was rebuilding economies, standardizing laws, and balancing three increasingly unruly realms. It was multitasking at an imperial level. Some knit scarves while listening to music. Margaret united half of Northern Europe over breakfast. And although she was deeply religious, because one had to be, or at least appear to be, Margaret kept the clergy in check with a motherly sternness, like someone who appreciates holy doctrine, but expects it to behave at dinner parties. She limited church land ownership and corralled ecclesiastical power without appearing blasphemous. A neat trick, that. She died in 1412, aboard a ship near Flensburg, still on royal business, still stewarding her makeshift Scandinavian jigsaw puzzle. No dramatic final words have been recorded, but we can reasonably assume they were something tidy and purposeful, perhaps along the lines of, "Leave the Union on my desk," and thus, under a veil of fog and strategy, Margaret drifted into legend, a woman who ruled three kingdoms by persuasion rather than sword, by inheritance rather than threat. Her legacy would wobble a bit after her departure, as multi-kingdom unions are known to do. But for a shining moment, the North was won, with Margaret at its quietly formidable helm. Now, let's wander a little eastward, where another queen was learning that power in medieval courts was measured not in gold, but in gossip and grand entrances. In the velvet dusk of 14th century Naples, a queen reigned with a heart full of contradictions, part saint, part scorpion, entirely unforgettable. Her name was Joanna I of Naples, and if you've never heard of her, it's only because history fell asleep before she could finish her story. Joanna was born into royal chaos, which is the only kind of chaos available in most royal families. The year was 1326, and Naples, that sunny heel of Italy's boot, was a place where political scheming was sport, marriages were battlefield tactics, and poisons were considered a good conversation starter at dinner. At age 6, because apparently toddlers made terrific heirs, Joanna became the heiress to the Neapolitan throne. By age 7, she was betrothed to her cousin, Andrew of Hungary, a gangly lad with an unfortunate haircut and even worse political instincts. It was a match designed by men who probably thought chess was a dating simulator. Andrew of Hungary had one goal: to be king. Joanna had one goal: for Andrew to stop talking. They were not exactly Italy's power couple. When her grandfather, the formidable King Robert the Wise, who was neither especially wise nor great at naming heirs, died in 1343, 17-year-old Joanna inherited the throne. Her coronation was a glittering affair, gilded robes, Latin chants, suspiciously squinting nobles. But the real drama simmered just beneath the silk. Andrew, still only a prince and not a king, took this very personally, as in locking himself in his room and writing angry letters to Hungary personally. Now, the good people of Naples weren't terribly fond of Andrew. He was foreign, clumsy, and either too generous or too stingy depending on the week. He was like that one-party guest who eats the last cannoli and then tries to play the lute. One humid Neapolitan night in 1345, while Joanna was conveniently not around, a group of nobles lured Andrew into a dark hallway and literally hung him out the window by his neck. This unfortunate ventilation solution ended with Andrew dead, and Joanna implicated faster than you can say habeas corpus. Scandal blossomed like overwatered basil. The Hungarians were furious and sent an army to avenge their dearly strangled. Joanna sensibly fled the country, being more partial to breathing than beheadings. She popped over to Provence, where she rallied support and dramatically insisted she wasn't guilty, at least not in any legally actionable way. Eventually, Joanna returned and reclaimed her crown, because even in medieval Europe, good PR and some well-placed bribes could turn a suspected felon into a legitimate monarch. She ruled Naples for over 30 years, married 3 more times, which even by medieval standards was impressively optimistic, and managed to outmaneuver popes, emperors, assassins, and her own family. Joanna was no shrinking violet. When the Black Death swept through Europe like a very inconsiderate houseguest, she stayed in Naples and tried to keep the peace with a combination of coins, sermons, and the occasional strongly worded decree. Despite the fact that plague doctors looked like birds and medicine involved surprisingly little actual science, Joanna led like a queen who rather preferred her subjects alive. But even queens can run out of luck. Toward the end of her reign, she supported the wrong pope. Yes, there were 2 at the time, because medieval church politics were just reality TV with mitres, and her enemies used it as an excuse to unseat her. One of them was her adopted nephew, Charles of Durazzo, whose main qualifications for rulership included ambition and a total absence of family loyalty. Charles captured Joanna in 1382, and despite some vigorous letter writing on her part, he had her quietly smothered in a locked room. Smothering, at the time, was considered an acceptable political resignation plan. Her death was as tangled in mystery as the rest of her reign, equal parts drama, tragedy, and unsolved family newsletter. Joanna remains one of history's most enigmatic queens, a woman accused of killing her husband, ruling across 4 marriages, facing 14th century politics with a steady gaze and a well-curated crown. Was she a murderess? A savvy ruler? A medieval Liz Taylor with a poisoned budget? History, in its eternal drowsiness, leans toward yes. And as the Neapolitan twilight flickers into the folds of memory, we turn our gaze northwest to a colder land, where an English queen with a lion's glare and 1,000 regrets waits softly in the wings. It was a rainy Tuesday in 1328 when Joan of Navarre, Duchess of Brittany, very nearly became the subject of an international incident involving a squabble over hats, a chessboard, and the questionable spelling of the word succession. Joan had little patience for nonsense, even less when it dripped from the fierce beards of French lawyers arguing over whether she should be allowed to inherit the throne of France. Poor Joan was a woman of many titles and even more unfortunate political circumstances. Born to Louis XVI of France and Margaret of Burgundy, she was the rightful heir to the Kingdom of Navarre. But, alas, being born with a second X chromosome in medieval Europe was often seen as something of a logistical inconvenience. The French nobility wrung their hands and stroked their beards. It was beard-stroking season, a highly active time for royal advisors, and decided that the so-called Salic law, which forbade female succession to the throne, applied with sudden and impeccable convenience. Still, Joan made quite the impression merely by surviving. Her early years were a masterclass in courtly dodgeball. For starters, her mother had been accused of adultery, a scandal that, in royal terms, made the front page of every metaphorical tavern conversation in Christendom. She was imprisoned, and little Joan was promptly sidelined from the French line of succession. Then came her father's death, under circumstances that raised more eyebrows than a badly timed jest about the Pope's haircut. Suspicion, drama, and a disputed inheritance. It was all the makings of a biopic with uncomfortable corsets and a surplus of candlelit monologues. But Joan, clever as she was quiet, navigated her curious place in history with the finesse of a chess grandmaster, moving pawns in woolen slippers. She eventually inherited the throne of Navarre in 1328, proving that even royal loopholes can be politely sidestepped if you have enough patience and a sufficiently strategic marriage. Ah, yes, her marriage. She wed Philip of Evreux, her first cousin, because nothing says dynastic ambition quite like marrying someone who shares your family crest and probably your favorite soup recipe. Their union was fairly peaceful by medieval standards. Fewer assassinations, more paperwork. Together, they ruled Navarre with a relatively light hand. One cupped gently around the complexities of governing a realm that straddled both French and Iberian politics. It was like trying to host a dinner party where half the guests enjoy fish stew and the other half consider it an act of war. Joan's rule as Queen Regnant of Navarre was marked by reforms, religious patronage, and an enduring sense of being underestimated. While French politics fumed and puffed like a disgruntled mule, she quietly established her authority, even commissioning local laws in the Basque language, a move as unusual as it was, dare we say, woke. In a time when queens were often expected to smile, sew, and stay invisible unless caught setting fires or stealing church silver, Joan chose influence over invisibility. Her court favoured diplomacy over drama, though in medieval courts that only reduced your chances of betrayal to, say, 80%, rather than the standard 95%. Yet she navigated political intrigue with the same gentle ferocity one might devote to embroidery with particularly difficult thread. She passed in 1349, likely of the Black Death, that grim party crasher of the 14th century. Philip followed her in death not long after, leaving behind a legacy of steady rule and 7 children who would scatter across Europe like politely raised dynastic dandelion seeds. And so, Joan of Navarre, daughter of a disgraced queen, a father with questionable demise, and a kingdom that kept trying to forget she existed, ruled with a quietness that echoed. She proved that not all queens had to raise armies or throw goblets to secure their place in history. Some just needed an iron spine, silk gloves, and the ability to nod thoughtfully while being underestimated. Now, as candlelight flickers low on our parchment page and rain drizzles softly against the castle window panes, let's tuck away the tale of Joan of Navarre and tiptoe toward another queen with a title, a tempter, and just a little taste for vengeance. In the frosty silence of 14th century Scandinavia, where snow often outnumbered solid political alliances, rose a queen so formidable, so quietly revolutionary. She turned frostbite into foreign policy. Her name was Margaret III of Denmark. And no, she didn't wear a horned helmet. That's Norse myth propaganda. She did, however, wear the crown of 3 kingdoms, and wore it terrifyingly well. Born in 1353, Margaret was the daughter of Valdemar IV of Denmark, a king so thrifty his coin purse may have been locked in a dungeon. Her marriage at age 10, yes, 10, ideal for starting a kingdom and conquering some sleep, was arranged to cement peace with a much taller, chillier neighbour, Norway. That union with King Haakon VI would eventually bloom into something resembling both mutual respect and mutual administrative exhaustion. But Margaret wasn't content to be a decorative queen, like a particularly shiny chess piece. No, as soon as she could reach the royal scrolls without a stepping stool, she began mastering diplomacy like a wizard with a ledger. Her most daring move: uniting 3 massive wintry kingdoms, Denmark, Norway and Sweden, under a squabbling yet innovative alliance known as the Kalmar Union. Think of it as a prototype for the European Union, except with more fur cloaks and far fewer Brussels sprouts. After the death of her father, her husband, and later her son Olaf, yes, poor Olaf, whose name would inspire happier snowmen centuries later, Margaret was left without any direct heir. Most monarchs would panic. Margaret calmly adopted her grandnephew, renamed him Eric, and said, "Here's your crown, child, don't drop it." Between reorganizing Baltic politics and adopting royalty like pets from a shelter, Margaret was managing to do something wild for her time. Rule with unmistakable competence. Male nobles grumbled sotto voce, peasants spread tales of her wisdom like bedtime myths, and even pirates in the North Sea thought twice before crossing her. She called herself a guardian of the realm, a modest euphemism for "I will run this kingdom until you find someone better await you on tea." And truly, they didn't. Her governance was marked by long-term vision, fiscal stability, and, critically, not being assassinated, a feat that placed her head and shoulders above many contemporaries, literally and politically. Now, to visualize Margaret ruling, imagine her seated on a throne that was probably drafty, writing letters in spidery script with pointed instructions like, "Tell the Swedes the meeting is at dawn," and "Cancel the grain tax before we all turn into breadless ghosts." She was one of those rare historical people who never seemed to need a resting royal face. She probably had a resting chessmaster face instead. All composed calculation behind alert Nordic eyes. Even when Sweden, forever the dramatic sibling, refused to play nice within her union, she managed them with a kind of maternal firmness that said, "You can protest, darling, but I control the crown and the food shipments." She also famously rode out to negotiate peace in storms, travelled extensively across kingdoms, and wore armour when necessary. Armour which, we presume, pinched awkwardly in a few places, but made quite the impression on medieval dignitaries. Was Margaret beloved? Not universally, but feared, respected, and never underestimated. Absolutely. She made alliances built on treaties and timetables, not marriages and moonlight, and somehow kept Scandinavia's ever-feuding kingdoms glued together by sheer force of political will. and possibly soup. It remains probable that much of her administration was powered by roasted turnips and tireless scribes. When Margaret died suddenly of the plague in 1412, aboard a ship no less, she died doing what she loved, travelling awkwardly yet assertively between cold places. Her legacy lingered across the fjords and forests. The Kalmar Union continued, shakily, like a three-legged table. But no other monarch quite managed her knack for managing male egos and economic reform in equal measure. In the cool mists of Scandinavian legend, she remains the Iron Lady of the North. No cape, no dragons, and just enough ambition to stitch three nations together while wearing a heavy dress and absolutely no nonsense. As moonlight filters through castle windows chilled by Baltic winds, we drift south from icy monarchs to the sun-dappled hills of Italy, where an empress unlike any other once ruled with poetry, power, and just a dash of poison. Now, drift with me to a small cluster of politically charged stone buildings perched between the majestic Alps and what might generously be described as overexcited taxation records. Welcome to 15th century Savoy. It's chilly, the kind of place where tea hasn't been invented yet, but everyone desperately wishes it had. Wool cloaks flap in the wind like disappointed flags, and somewhere inside the austere Chateau de Chambéry, a young woman is becoming formidable. Meet Margaret of Austria. Not to be confused with the other half-dozen Margarets your history teacher didn't warn you about. This Margaret is often described by scholars as a shrewd regent, which is polite historical code for better at managing power than any man in the room, and probably terrifying at parties. Born in 1480, Margaret of Austria was the daughter of Emperor Maximilian IX and Mary of Burgundy, thus making her the medieval European version of a LinkedIn overachiever. Before her 10th birthday, Margaret had been betrothed to a French prince, sent to court for tutoring in elegance, and diplomatically rejected, probably with a note handwritten in gold leaf saying something like, "Dear Margaret, it's not you, it's geopolitics." But Margaret, bless her polished composure, did not sulk. No dramatic poetry scribbled in eyeliner, no castle burning in effigy. Instead, she got engaged again and again. She wore political engagement like it was medieval speed dating, but each cancelled wedding only seemed to sharpen her wits and her quiet certainty that she'd never let anyone else write her story for her again. Eventually, she married Juan, the son of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Spanish royals famous for launching ships and inquisitions. Their marriage, sadly, lasted about as long as a medieval breadstick. Juan died 6 months later, and while Margaret sincerely mourned, she also got busy doing something few widows did: reading inheritance law. Over the next few years, Margaret slowly transformed into a kind of proto-European commissioner, fluent in French, German, and the fine art of not letting men interrupt her. She took on the regency of the Netherlands for her nephew Charles. Yes, that Charles, who would later juggle the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and a persistent chin. As regent, Margaret ran the Burgundian Netherlands with a mix of elegance and quiet tyranny. She held court at Mechlin, turning dry policy debates into salons where economics danced with etiquette. Her household became famed for its scholarship and silk upholstery, and her taxation reforms would make even modern accountants swoon with admiration, or at least respectfully yawn. She also had a soft spot for art and artists, collecting tapestries and commissioning manuscripts like a medieval curator who also happened to chase pirates off the coast when they interrupted Flemish trade. But Margaret's greatest skill, perhaps, lay in negotiation. She signed peace treaties, like she was autographing fan mail. One particularly famous one, the Treaty of Cambrai. Historians affectionately call it the Lady's Peace because it was orchestrated entirely by Margaret and Louise of Savoy, the mother of King Francis I of France. Two women sitting down to untangle decades of war, while the men presumably jousted themselves into a corner. Frankly, this treaty deserves a musical. Of course, being brilliant also meant being misunderstood. Margaret was often called austere, stern, or, heaven forbid, too independent, which in polite court society meant not married enough. She responded by outliving suitors, commissioning her own mausoleum, and ruling until her death in 1530 with nary a scandal. She wasn't interested in being remembered in someone else's romance. She was far too busy being Europe's most influential aunt, and so, in her robes of state velvet and philosophical detachment, Margaret of Austria remains one of history's quieter hurricanes, a woman whose diplomacy stitched together empires, whose artwork whispered of political intent, and whose ability to govern put many kings to shame. All this with nary a sword swung or eyebrow raised. Now, as the candlelight fades on Margaret's neatly lettered treaties and the velvets settle into soft dust, let your thoughts drift onward. Another queen waits just beyond the fog of time, with secrets draped in silk and stories stacked higher than her headdress. In the late 12th century, beneath the flickering torchlight of the Plantagenet court, a queen operated with such silent calculation she could have given the chessboard a nervous twitch. Eleanor of Aquitaine may have had the flair, and Isabella of France the drama, but let us dim the candlelight now for a lesser-sung, velvet-gloved schemer, Berengaria of Navarre. Yes, Berengaria, a name that sounds like it belongs more to a kindly librarian than the Queen of England. But history has a fine sense of ridiculousness. She was wed to the lion-hearted Richard III, better known as Richard the Lionheart, a man who spent approximately 0 minutes being husbandly and most of his marriage galloping across Crusader kingdoms like a glorified action figure. Berengaria's love story, if we may call it that with a knowing smirk, is most notable for how it simply missed the mark. For starters, she wasn't even crowned queen until after Richard had already gone crusading, because nothing says romantic honeymoon like waving hello and goodbye on the same dock. She met Richard in Sicily, which may sound idyllic, but the circumstances were a touch frostier than a Mediterranean brochure would have you believe. Richard had been technically engaged to another woman, Alice of France, who had been kept waiting so long in England, she probably forgot what continent she was from. And just when Alice thought her invitation to the royal wedding would read, "As bride," dear Richard swapped her out like last season's tapestry. Enter Berengaria, diplomatic pawn and impeccably mannered daughter of Sancho VI of Navarre. With her pristine lineage and delightfully neutral political stance, she was the perfect candidate for a marriage that wouldn't upset too many knights or nobles. And so, aboard a ship fit for queens, and one must note with mild concern, notoriously seasick, Berengaria sailed toward immortality and a landless convent-esque existence. But fret not, that's not the cozy part. Once married, and once Richard inevitably vanished into the Holy Land like a medieval Where's Waldo, Berengaria settled into a role history reserved for the exceptionally patient and chronically neglected. Queen Consort of England, but not really in England. In fact, she never set foot in the country as queen, which somehow feels like the Tudor version of being ghosted after matrimony. Still, despite the absence of a country, a castle, and occasionally her spouse, Berengaria proved to be the kind of low drama queen the realm didn't appreciate until centuries later. No wars, no accusations of infidelity, no mysterious poisonings over dimly lit goblets, just meticulous letter writing, deeply responsible financial management, and the sort of unflappable moral compass that probably got on people's nerves during feast season. When Richard met his untimely end, spoiler alert, it involves a crossbow bolt launched by a rebellious teenager and a surprising lack of body armor. Berengaria didn't wail, burn castles, or marry again. Instead, she did something even more shocking for the medieval era. She handled his debts, yes. While other widowed queens schemed for power or remarriage, Berengaria combed through royal ledgers like a tax enthusiast, with a candle and a grudge. She wrote letters to King John, Richard's delightfully untrustworthy brother, asking politely and then pointedly for the pension owed to her. And John, being John, didn't pay. Several times. Occasionally, he answered her requests with something between a vague promise and what we might call royal ghosting. Berengaria, to her absolute merit, persisted. She wrote, she negotiated, she leaned on popes, and eventually, years past the initial snubbing, she received her due. Not from John, of course, but from Henry III, who at least had the decency to inherit a sense of shame about the whole affair. Berengaria lived out her twilight years in Le Mans. In a modest abbey she founded herself, a sleepy stone refuge surrounded by wildflowers, nuns, and the comforting sound of absolutely no court intrigue. It's said she prayed regularly, embroidered with the devotion of a saint, and maintained enough dignity to make even the rowdiest noble pause before borrowing a goblet. She is perhaps a queen best remembered not for swords or scandal, but for the quiet, steady hum of administrative excellence. A queen who proved that sometimes the most radical act in a medieval monarchy was to simply do what was right and stick to it. And with Berengaria safely tucked into her convent of calm, we turn our gaze toward another queen, whose crown was less tranquil and decidedly more soaked in treachery. By the time we reach the court of Isabella of France, we've crossed land, sea, and a fair bit of patience. Born around 1295, daughter of Philip IV of France, whom contemporaries nicknamed Philip the Fair, not for his justice, but for his unusually symmetrical cheekbones, Isabella had the sort of pedigree that made medieval matchmakers foam at the goblet. She spoke multiple languages, played the lute, danced with dignity, and, crucially, knew how to throw a side-eye sharper than a knight's lance. When she married Edward II of England in 1308, it seemed like a good match. France and England were forming that kind of alliance that usually meant less war and more awkward dinners with in-laws. But Isabella was in for a surprise. Edward came with a +1, a man named Piers Gaveston, his constant companion, confidant, and suspected more than friend. Within weeks of the wedding, Isabella found herself third-wheeling in her own royal marriage. Now, medieval queens didn't have podcasts, therapy, or Twitter subtweets to express their discontent. So Isabella smiled, waved, and plotted with the poise of someone who really wished she could chuck a goblet now and again. Edward's affection for Gaveston was so overwhelming that he handed him titles, lands, and possibly the last remaining shred of royal diplomacy. The English nobility, naturally, foamed at the collar. The barons eventually forced Edward to exile Gaveston, who boomeranged back to court like a particularly dramatic bad penny. The situation spiraled more dramatically than a medieval romance novel, until Gaveston was, shall we say, permanently removed by nobles who weren't particularly interested in loyalty oaths or subtlety. With Gaveston gone, one might think Isabella and Edward could patch things up over a shared mead and mutual political ambition. But alas, Edward replaced one favourite with another, Hugh Despenser. Isabella didn't need tarot cards to know this was bad news. Hugh and Edward were inseparable. And again, Isabella was sidelined. Her influence diminished to the decorative qualities of her headpiece. Here's where things take a darkly comedic spin. In 1325, Edward, perhaps realizing things were dicey with France, sent Isabella to negotiate peace with her homeland. She agreed, packed her gowns, and took their teenage son, the future Edward III, as diplomatic leverage. Once on French soil, Isabella did not, as expected, scurry home. Instead, she linked up with Roger Mortimer, a disgruntled English noble and certified bad boy with a velvet cloak and possibly emotional unavailability. Together, Isabella and Mortimer raised an army, a queen turned rebel, draped in silks, garnished with grievances, returning to England in 1326 to depose her own husband. They made it look deceptively elegant, like a royal coup but with tasteful drapery. Edward and Hugh fled but were eventually captured. Hugh was executed in what one chronicler described as inventive detail, delivered through the kind of gruesome court justice that feels rather unsuited to bedtime. So we'll just say he did not die quietly. Edward himself was forced to abdicate in favour of his son, who was only 14. The teenager with emotional whiplash became King Edward III. Meanwhile, Isabella acted as regent, ruling England alongside Mortimer and reportedly redecorating the realm in her own fashion. Unfortunately for Isabella, the regency didn't stay rosy. Mortimer, now vastly powerful, began walking with a kind of swagger that spooked the nobles, and Edward III, grown a bit and less keen on being a puppet, staged a coup of his own at age 17. Mortimer was arrested and executed, proving once again that no good romance survives English politics. Isabella, however, was spared. She wasn't tossed into a dungeon. She retired gracefully, or as gracefully as a rebel queen can, to a life of prayer, property management, and perhaps the occasional whispered tale to a curious granddaughter. In the end, Isabella of France was remembered by some as the She-Wolf of France, a title rich in dramatic flair and possibly overestimated bite. She lived long enough to see her son become one of England's most celebrated kings, her former enemies turn to dust, and her collection of velvet robes gather peaceful moths. And as the night sways softly forward, let us drift gently toward another queen waiting in the wings, one whose secrets sleep just beneath the polished stones of another European court. We now drift toward the chilly winds of Scandinavia, where fur cloaks and longboats were the fashion, and winters lasted longer than some royal family feuds. Nestled in the early 12th century, deep in the frost-kissed fjords of Norway, we meet a queen whose story is stitched together from sagas, swordplay, and just enough scandal to keep you wide-eyed for 60 additional seconds, or until the lull of history tucks you right back in. Her name was Margaret Fredkulla, or Margaret the Maiden of Peace, as the more poetic chroniclers preferred to call her, which is a rather splendid nickname unless you're trying to sound intimidating at Viking PTA meetings. Margaret was what you'd call political duct tape, sturdy, essential, and suddenly very popular when borders started fraying. Born a Swedish princess around 1080, she was traded in marriage not once, but twice, to help paper over squabbles between kingdoms. She had a knack for diplomacy that could probably resolve a tavern brawl with a subtle smile and perhaps a well-timed tray of smoked herring. Her first marriage was to King Magnus of Norway, a fellow with grand ideas and a rather old-fashioned sense of anger management. The peace deal between Sweden and Norway hinged on their union, and Margaret brought with her a hefty dowry and enough brocade to wallpaper half of Oslo. Unfortunately, Magnus died before they could set up a co-authored monarchy blog, leaving Margaret widowed and gently bewildered in unfamiliar territory. Not to be left single long, because heaven forbid a queen should be allowed to pick a hobby. Margaret was soon married off again, this time to King Niels of Denmark. Now, Niels was the kind of king who could be easily mistaken for one of those monks who never spoke much, stoic, slow to act, and about as exciting as boiled oats. But Margaret, she had a twinkle in her eye and the administrative sense of someone who color codes parchment scrolls for fun. In Denmark, she was more than just a wife. She was, by all reliable guesses, running the entire show. Coins were minted with her name and image, a power move rarely afforded to queens and usually reserved for fellows in crowns with names like Ethel something. Margaret didn't just support Niels. She outshone him so thoroughly that one begins to suspect she was the reason Denmark remembered to have a kingdom at all. She brought stability in a time of great wobble. She smoothed over noble disputes, reined in overzealous bishops, and apparently introduced the Danes to the scandalous idea of not fighting each other over breakfast. Her name, Fredkulla, literally means peace woman in Old Norse, though again, it sounds less like a nickname and more like the title of a very calming documentary about moss. Under her guidance, Denmark prospered. And by prospered, of course, we mean pockets of rural tranquility, punctuated by occasional Viking squabbles and the general medieval reluctance to bathe. But still, for the Middle Ages, things were going pretty smoothly. She bore a son, Magnus the Strong, whose name promised biceps and delivered only additional dynastic drama, as we'll quietly ignore until the next paragraph. Margaret, however, managed something few queens ever did in this era: to wield soft power so efficiently that the hard power, the swords and siege equipment, stayed mostly in their sheds. She ruled without shouting, reigned without rebellions. Her presence was like that warm mulled mead you drink slowly by firelight, gentle, purposeful, and surprisingly potent after 3 chalices. But even queens known as peace women are not exempt from history's sharp turns. Margaret died, as historical figures tend to do. Her passing left a vacuum that was almost immediately filled with the kind of familial infighting that makes you question whether royal bloodlines should come with a user manual. Her son Magnus would take Denmark to the brink, proof, perhaps, that inherited titles rarely come with instruction scrolls. Still, Margaret left behind more than coinage and calmer borders. She left behind an idea that diplomacy could be done in silk rather than steel. A medieval queen who operated with the subtle flair of a political illusionist, where you only realize she moved everything after she's already bowed out. And so, with furs wrapped tighter and the glow of candlelight waning, we sail quietly onward across the cold waters of the Baltic, where another royal woman waits, with secrets hidden in her armor and a crown just barely balanced on the edge of war. Eleanor of Aquitaine was, to put it mildly, the medieval version of a thunderstorm wearing a velvet gown. Not because she raged, though perhaps she did on occasion, but because she had a majestic flair for arriving uninvited, stirring everything up, and then disappearing with equal drama. If European royalty had a chessboard, Eleanor was the queen that refused to stay on her own square. Born in the sunny duchy of Aquitaine in 1122, a place famous for poets, wine and high-quality intrigue, Eleanor inherited vast lands at just 15. This made her the most eligible bachelorette since Helen of Troy, minus the launching of 1,000 ships bit. Although, come to think of it, she did manage to launch a dozen political upheavals, a few rebellious sons, and at least one unsuccessful crusade. Not bad for someone who probably had to get up for mass before breakfast. First, she married Louis VII of France, which sounded nice in theory, but in practice was a bit like pairing a lion with a nervous monk. Sweet Louis was devout, pious, and rather more interested in saving his soul than entertaining Eleanor's passion for music, politics, and not being bored to tears. Together, they went on the Second Crusade, which was an excellent opportunity for Eleanor to practice international diplomacy and for Louis to realize his wife was better at commanding attention than he was at commanding armies. Eleanor, not content with just issuing gentle advice from behind the throne, stirred up such a magnificent fracas during the crusade that rumors swirled about her alleged affair with her own uncle, Raymond of Antioch. Whether true or not, Louis decided that this excursion might better serve as a prelude to annulment. And voila, after 15 years, their marriage was dissolved due to consanguinity, which is a fancy medieval way of saying we were too closely related anyway, oopsie. Now single, fabulously wealthy, and slightly scandalous, Eleanor did what any sensible woman in the 12th century would do. She married the younger, far more ambitious Henry, Duke of Normandy, who would soon become King Henry II of England. Think of it as going from Gregorian chants to political heavy metal overnight. With Henry, Eleanor bore 8 children, 2 of whom would become quite famous indeed: Richard the Lionheart and King John. You know, the one from Robin Hood fame, forever leaning into tax collection and bad decisions. Queen Eleanor wasn't content to just pop out sons and supervise embroidery. She ruled over her own duchy, corresponded with the great minds of her time, and turned her court into a haven for troubadours. Her court at Poitiers was like medieval Paris Fashion Week, but with more liars and significantly more chainmail. The marriage, however, turned sour faster than a barrel of wine left in the sun. Henry was one of those kings who collected mistresses the way falcons collect feathers, and Eleanor, unsurprisingly, was not thrilled by the growing flock. Eventually, things reached such dramatic heights that Eleanor supported her sons in a full-blown rebellion against their father. Calling it a family squabble doesn't quite do it justice. It was more of a royal Game of Thrones with better wigs and worse plumbing. Henry won the rebellion, and Eleanor was promptly put on a sort of regal house arrest for the next 16 years. 16. That's almost 2 decades of "you're grounded, no politics for you." However, she wasn't exactly locked in a dungeon. She lived in castles, had servants, dined well, and probably had more privacy than ever before, which, if you think about it, might not have been the worst retirement plan. When Henry finally passed away, after years spent battling his own children and his own rage, Eleanor returned to power in full force. At nearly 70, she acted as regent again, handled complex diplomacy, arranged the marriage of her granddaughter to the King of France, and dragged herself across the Pyrenees in snow and sleet to ensure everything went according to plan. She was less old dowager queen and more crossbow-carrying matriarch fueled by sheer willpower. Even in her final years, tucked away respectfully in the Abbey of Fontevraud, Eleanor was not idle. She managed estates, read widely, and likely shook her head fondly as tales of crusades, betrayals, and misbehaving grandchildren reached her ears. So if you ever feel too tired, too old, or too surrounded by dramatic adult children to be productive, remember Eleanor. She lived, loved, ruled, rebelled, survived imprisonment, and retired gracefully, all while wearing gowns you could probably camp under. And from Eleanor's stormy saga, we drift now to a quieter court, though, as you'll see, silence does not always mean peace. If ever there was a queen who turned courtly chaos into a full-time occupation, it was Joanna of Naples. Born in 1326, and destined perhaps by mischief-loving stars to rule one of the most diplomatically entangled corners of 14th century Europe, Joanna's life played out like a soap opera. If that soap opera had more plague, papal bulls, and at least 3 suspiciously timed poisonings. Joanna became queen at just 16, which, let's be honest, was around middle age by the standards of the Middle Ages. Her grandfather, King Robert the Wise, gifted her the throne the same way grandfathers today might hand off an old bonsai tree and say, "Good luck keeping it alive." Naples, you see, had a delightful habit of changing political alliances like undergarments, frequently and often under dire circumstances. But Joanna was prepared, or rather, she pretended to be, which is arguably just as effective in politics. Soon after her coronation, she married her Hungarian cousin, Andrew, a union designed to unite Naples and Hungary in holy and mostly uncomfortable matrimony. Andrew, poor thing, had grand ideas of ruling Naples himself. Without realizing, he was married to a woman who had absolutely no plans of sharing. The Neapolitan nobility weren't thrilled with Andrew either. He was foreign, inexperienced, and not particularly charming. So when he started demanding a crown of his own, the mood shifted from annoyance to murdery. Andrew's untimely death came in 1345, in an incident involving a castle window, a rope, and gravity, none of which favored him. He was dragged out of his room and flung to his doom like yesterday's laundry. The local authorities, who probably didn't want to investigate their own brunch companions, ruled it unfortunate. The Hungarians, however, suspected Joanna had a regal hand in the matter, possibly holding the rope. King Louis of Hungary, Andrew's brother and proud owner of a sizable Hungarian army, wasn't content with that explanation. He invaded Naples, storming through Italy in the name of family honor and aggressive foreign policy. Joanna, in response, did what any self-respecting medieval monarch would do. She popped over to France to explain things to the Pope. Pope Clement VI, possibly the most patient man of the decade, listened to Joanna's version of events, which may have included tears, theatrics, and a reminder that the Hungarians hadn't been exactly courteous house guests. To everyone's surprise, she convinced him. Not only did she get papal absolution, but he also validated her right to rule. Joanna then promptly married again, and then again, and again. In fact, she went through 4 husbands in total, which, even by the standards of medieval monarchy, is a bit of a power move. Each ally she married was meant to solidify her authority, though most of them turned out to be either disappointingly lifeless or suspiciously short-lived. Perhaps it was romance. Perhaps it was realpolitik with garnishes of widow's weeds. Either way, the court tailors stayed busy. Through famines, plagues, rebellions, and more backstabbing than a cutlery drawer, Joanna somehow managed to cling to her throne with velvet gloves and a steel grip. She championed the arts, welcomed scholars, and legalized giving the Pope a respectfully skeptical eyebrow raise. But even Joanna could not outmaneuver all her enemies forever. Toward the end of her reign, she made the rather bold political shift of supporting a rival pope during a time when Europe couldn't even agree on which holy man wore the right hat. Unfortunately, this painted a rather convenient target on her back. In 1382, her own cousin, Charles of Durazzo, decided that Joanna's papal preferences were grounds for a hostile takeover. He captured Naples and had Joanna smothered in her castle, ending her reign, but not her legend. Even in death, she remained a puzzle. Was she a Machiavellian matriarch, or a queen simply trying to survive the chessboard of medieval diplomacy? Perhaps both. As the Mediterranean night settles over the shadowy harbours of Naples, her tale echoes softly through stone archways and marble halls, ambitious, tragic, and worthy of whispered reenactments beneath candlelight. Next, we wander northward, where another queen awaits. Less scandal, perhaps, but no less cunning. Let us tiptoe on. There are queens who wore crowns made of gold, and there are others who wore metaphorical crowns made entirely of political chaos and sheer audacity. Today, we find ourselves in the candlelit corridors of 14th century Naples, where Queen Joanna of Arc reigned, or perhaps more accurately, sort of reigned, frequently fled, got excommunicated, unexcommunicated, and then re-excommunicated again, which is, frankly, a very specific and exhausting spiritual cardio. Joanna wasn't just Queen of Naples, oh no. Like a medieval collector of impressive titles, she added Queen of Sicily, Countess of Provence, and a few other scattered goodies to her resume. She came into power in 1343 at the tender age of 16, which was practically geriatric for medieval marriage, but precocious for ruling a kingdom with constant existential dread issues. Now, many queens faced obstacles from rival lords, scheming nobles, or distant empires. Joanna, though, had a husband problem, specifically her first husband, Andrew of Hungary, who was, how can we put this kindly, unpopular. Nobles hated him, the Neapolitan populace found him dreadfully foreign, and Joanna, well, she didn't seem terribly fond either. One evening in 1345, while vacationing at a picturesque royal villa, never trust a scenic retreat in medieval politics, Andrew was dangled out a window with all the ceremony of a damp bedsheet, and then murdered below. It was all very theatrical, suspiciously theatrical, and who was blamed? Yes, everyone pointed fingers at Joanna. The Pope summoned her to explain. Hungary invaded Naples to avenge their fallen Andrew. And for someone likely innocent, she was never properly convicted. Joanna had a truly terrible alibi. Absolute silence. To escape the drama, Joanna fled to France and then obtained the Pope's forgiveness by elegantly marrying his relative, Louis of Taranto. Nepotism in its highest ecclesiastical form. How very tidy. But did her troubles stop there? Perhaps it would have been a gentler tale if yes. Unfortunately, Joanna just couldn't stop inheriting problematic men. Louis turned out to be politically average, her court got messier than ever, and Naples was constantly under threat from the ever-patient, ever-fuming Hungarian royals. The kind of in-laws you simply can't stop ghosting. And then, as if to ensure her life would one day be covered in a strange, insomnia-curing bedtime podcast, Joanna committed a bold act of medieval mic-dropping. During the Great Schism of the Catholic Church, yes, the time when Europe was so indecisive it had two popes, Joanna chose sides, boldly. While most of Christendom gasped and tried to sit on the ecclesiastical fence, she aligned herself with the French Pope in Avignon. The Roman Pope, feeling he'd been picked last for a very serious game of divine dodgeball, promptly excommunicated her, again. This excommunication was dangerous. One generally wishes to avoid spiritual banishment when one rules a Catholic kingdom. But Joanna, bless her determined chaos, responded by adopting Louis of Anjou as her heir, cousin to the French king, which understandably enraged Charles of Durazzo, her cousin and the designated heir under Hungarian influence. In a plot twist so Shakespearean it predates Shakespeare, Charles marched south with an army, claimed the kingdom, and imprisoned Joanna in the castle of Muro. There, in 1382, at the age of 56, an impressive age for a queen who had dodged papal condemnation and multiple husbands, a group of guards allegedly smothered her with a pillow, which, you know, is one way to resign, politely suffocated. And yet, centuries later, Neapolitans still speak of her with a strange blend of affection and scandalous awe. Was she a killer, a victim of royal politics, an early practitioner of chaotic neutral diplomacy? Likely, all three. What she lacked in military brilliance or popular support, she overcompensated for with sheer narrative drama. And in that, Queen Joanna I stands enshrined in the footnotes of European history as a woman who refused, utterly refused, to be boring. Even if her reign came with an absurd number of popes, husbands, and dramatic exits. Now, the candle flickers low in the royal chamber. The politics have paused, the windows are bolted, and the pillows, thankfully, stay where they belong. Let us drift further now, toward one last queen, whose legend outlasted her kingdom. As the medieval curtain draws to a close, and the mossy stones of ancient castles slumber under ivy blankets, we come to one final queen, perhaps not the most notorious in the tabloids of her time, but richly crowned with the kind of subtle brilliance history keeps tucked under her pillow. Enter Isabella of Castile, not Elizabeth, not Catherine, no Anne or Eleanor here. This is Isabella, Queen of Castile, wife of Ferdinand of Aragon, and human catalyst to more than one world-altering event. But for now, she arrives softly in our sleepy reverie, wrapped not in royal fanfare, but in the quiet rustle of parchment, maps, the whisper of old tapestries, and the faint clink of a sword being ceremonially retired for the night. You might know Isabella as the woman who sent Columbus sailing off into the unknown, but let's not leap into that ocean yet. Before she flung open the doors to the new world, and unintentionally a whole bouquet of calamities, Isabella was busy uniting Spain, outmaneuvering scheming nobles, and choosing her own husband, which, in the 15th century, was as rebellious as dyeing your pet ferret purple and naming it Pope. Marrying Ferdinand was no small feat. Royal matchmaking in the Middle Ages was a diplomatic version of speed dating. If you were handcuffed to your father's economic interests and surrounded by armoured chaperones. Isabella, however, calmly sidestepped all the proposals and suitors tossed her way like overcooked stew at a jousting banquet. Then, cool as chilled custard, she whispered, "I do," to Ferdinand without permission from anyone with a title longer than their own name. And that was the start of something enormous. Together, they formed the now famous Catholic monarchs, a duo that managed to unify most of Spain, not by cuddle diplomacy, mind you, but through a bit of conquest, a dash of administration, and the occasional unfortunate expulsion of entire communities. It's bedtime, dear listener, so we won't linger on the Inquisition tonight. We'll tuck that troubling footnote under the featherbed and thank it kindly for its historical complexity. Isabella was a woman of iron will under silk veils. She read voraciously, ruled deliberately, and managed to keep her children in line longer than most medieval queens, a feat honestly, more miraculous than any battle victory. She also had a fondness for learning and championed education, like a noble librarian with royal backing. If you ever find yourself in a dusty archive in Spain, you might stumble across her handwriting on royal decrees, treaties, and perhaps the odd grocery list. 1 cask olive oil, 3 wool cloaks, 5 ships for ambitious Italian sailor. Yes, that would be Columbus. Now, I know, the man is a controversial bedtime story, even when told in a whisper. But Isabella, for her part, took a real gamble, pawning some of her jeweled things to fund the voyage, which, if you've ever tried to convince your partner to fund a 6-month oceanic mystery tour led by a man who thought Asia was just around the corner, you'll know she had either great vision or a very mischievous mood that morning. Whatever her motives, the voyage happened. Maps were redrawn, and history, like fresh ink, spread across the parchment of continents. Isabella's name became etched not just in Europe, but in the halls of the New World, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with accusations that echo even now. But here, between candlelight and shadows, we remember her too as the woman who outwitted her half-brother to claim her throne, who rode with armies, and who believed, stubbornly and sincerely, in her divine right to improve her kingdom, even if her methods were occasionally more combustible than comfy. She died with the crown firmly on her head, and her legacy woven into the very seams of Renaissance Spain. Not bad for a queen born into civil war, reared among courtiers plotting like over-caffeinated chess players, and who said no to more foreign princes than a picky princess at a royal buffet. And so, Queen Isabella closes our gallery of notorious medieval monarchs, not with scandal, not with seduction, but with a potent kind of power. The power of focus, fire, and a slightly alarming ability to reorganize an entire nation between prayers. The torches fade now as the stone corridors sigh to themselves. Our medieval queens rest once more in their tapestried halls. History folds itself like linen at the foot of a bed. Close your eyes, dear listener. The crown is heavy, but dreams are lighter. Let them carry you where no map need guide, and no kingdom demands your rule, at least until morning.